It's my pleasure to welcome you to this important event entitled U.S. Empire and the Wars in Iran and Lebanon, sponsored by the Center for Middle East Studies and co-sponsored by the Chicago Center for Contemporary Theory. I'm Lisa Wedeen, and I'm the director of the Chicago Center for Contemporary Theory, or 3CT for short, and I'm also on the executive committee of the Center for Middle Eastern Studies. When I first wanted to do an event on the wars and to think more deeply about this new and brutal instantiation of U.S. empire, I was worried about overburdening my colleagues here, or anywhere for that matter. It's exhausting and dispiriting to be a scholar of the Middle East these days, and many of us here have family and loved ones who are under direct assault. It's important to recognize, moreover, that this experience of being terrorized by the United States and Israeli violence is not so new, even while there are continuities with past wars and aspects of the situation that do seem novel. That is one of the questions we'll explore today. And although the brutality is direct when bombs are being dropped, as John Mearsheimer has argued, unilateral US sanctions have added another kind of devastating violence. They've been responsible for an estimated 38 million deaths worldwide from 1971 to 2021, in Mearsheimer's estimation, drawing on a Lancet piece from 2025, or in the words of the Lancet itself, over the past decade, unilateral sanctions have caused around 560,000 annual deaths worldwide. It's hard to think of other policy interventions with such adverse effects on human life that continue to be pervasively used, they conclude, except perhaps outright war, which is also pervasively used. Israel, for example, has now seized a larger percentage of Lebanon's total landmass than Russia has taken from Ukraine since its invasion in 2022. Whereas the Russian land grab was met with international outrage and multi-sectoral sanctions, the silence on Israel's land grab in Lebanon is deafening. We know that some people are more eligible for grief than others, as Judith Butler, as well as other scholars, have pointed out, but I, for one, refuse to accept that asymmetries in power should mangle our judgments, making some lives more valuable than others. Israel's Minister of National Security, Itamar Ben-Gvir, wears a noose pin on his lapel, proudly advertising his position that Palestinian prisoners deserve execution by hanging. And the West Bank is subjected to relentless attacks while the ceasefire in Gaza serves as an alibi for Israel to continue brutalizing Gazans in an ongoing genocide. Meanwhile, the world's attention is elsewhere. To be clear, the Trump's presidency's toying with a war that may become a world war is attention-grabbing, with Trump's threats to bomb Iran into the, quote, Stone Age, unquote, spoken with a callousness that defies any even pretense to human decency. For those of us who are scholars critical of liberalism, it behooves us to ask whether the pretense so clearly missing here might have mattered after all. Whether the veneer supplied by human rights discourses actually generated guardrails that are absent in this current conflict. This change, the absence of a need to pay even lip service to human rights considerations, has facilitated the practice of a new fascist consensus in Israel, as well as what Robert Meister has called, in the American context, new forms of imperial avowal. Less a moral justification for righteous war, or the common I know very well, but nevertheless rationalization for business as usual, than a shamelessly arrogated freedom to act with imperial impunity. Before I introduce our speakers today, I would like to acknowledge the staff for their stellar work changing channels here. In particular, I would like to thank Associate Director Tom McGuire and Bayan Abusharara from CMES for their excellent work organizing this event. Thanks are also owed to the 3CT's staff, Student Assistant Lucy De Silva, our Program Coordinator Ryan Eckholt, and Associate Director Anna Cyril Jones. Please give them all a hand. Because we have a number of speakers and they are all local and so hopefully don't need grand introductions, I'll just provide the titles of each. But please know how grateful I am to each and every one for finding the bandwidth to do this. John J. Mearsheimer is the R. Wendell Harrison Distinguished Service Professor of Political Science. Alireza Doostdar is the Director of the Center for Middle Eastern Studies and Associate Professor of Islamic Studies and the Anthropology of Religion in the Divinity School. Mehrnoush Soroush is an assistant professor in ancient Near Eastern studies in the Department of Middle Eastern Studies. Ghenwa Hayek is associate professor of modern Arabic literature in the Department of Middle Eastern Studies and deputy dean of humanities. And Aaron Jakes is associate professor of modern Middle Eastern history in the Department of History. Please join me in welcoming Aaron.
Pleasure to be here. Thank you all for coming out. I'm going to talk a little bit about the causes of the Iran war, sort of where we're at today and where we're headed in my allotted 10 minutes. When you talk about the causes of the war, it's very important to understand that it's linked with the goals of the war. Let me just talk about what the goals of the war were, at least in the beginning, before the war started. And initially, we talked about eliminating completely Iran's capability to enrich nuclear uranium, enrich uranium to nuclear weapons grade levels. Number two, doing away with Iran's ballistic missiles for all intents and purposes. Three, getting Iran to stop supporting Hamas, Hezbollah, and the Houthis, those three things. And then the fourth was regime change. And I argued beforehand, and I think it's true when I explain more about the war, that you had to get regime change to get the other three goals. In other words, you had to get rid of the regime to get rid of the ballistic missiles, to get rid of the nuclear enrichment capability, to get rid of support for the Houthis, Hamas, and Hezbollah. So regime change was the ultimate goal. I think ultimately the Israelis, although they didn't say this much publicly, really wanted to destroy Iran and make it look like Syria. But the goal, I think, going into the war, certainly for the Trump administration, is regime change. Now, what happened here was that the Israelis convinced President Trump that we could win a quick and decisive victory. My view of how wars start is that invariably states go to war when they think they can win quick and decisive victories. It makes common sense. You don't go to war thinking it's going to be a long, protracted, bloody war where there's a serious possibility that you lose. You think you have a magic formula or a clever strategy that will allow you to win. And the Israelis, mainly the Mossad, in the form of David Barnea, who's the head of the Mossad, convinced both Netanyahu, especially President Trump and his closest advisors, that they had a magic formula. That was that we would use air power in a shock and awe campaign that involved decapitating the leadership in Iran. And that would almost immediately lead to an uprising in the population because they all believed that the governors, the governing forces in Iran had a weak foundation underneath it. It would be easy to topple that regime in Iran with air power alone. I would note to you, without getting into it now, that the historical record is unequivocally clear that toppling regimes with air power alone does not work. But anyway, they came to believe it. And on February 28th, they went to war. And of course, they did decapitate the regime. There's no question about that. They did launch a shock and awe policy or strategy, but it failed. And this invariably happens in these cases when you go to war with a quick, thinking you can win a quick and decisive victory, and you don't win it, you find yourself in a war of attrition. Fundamentally different war. So the question is, where are we today, given that the strategy failed? The fact is, the Iranians are in the driver's seat, and we are in deep trouble. President Trump committed a colossal blunder that he personally, politically, is going to pay a great cost for, and we are all going to pay for it, and people all around the world are going to pay for it. Now, last night, he gave a speech, and when you listen to the achievements, right, he talked about the fact we've destroyed the Iranian Air Force, we've destroyed the Iranian Navy, and so forth and so on. Who cares? Those were not our goals. I told you what the goals were. Get rid of Iranian ballistic missiles. We have not achieved that. We're not close. We just read the paper every day. We've not given them to give up their nuclear enrichment capability. And if anything, we've given them a greater incentive than ever to acquire nuclear weapons. And the people who are now in charge in Iran are more hawkish on that issue than the Iranian leaders were on February 22nd. In terms of supporting Hezbollah, the Houthis, and Hamas, that has not changed at all. And indeed, the Iranians are coordinating with Hezbollah to attack northern Israel and Israeli forces in southern Lebanon. And in terms of regime change, the regime is strengthened by this war, not weakened by this war. And again, the historical record is unequivocally clear on this, right? When you go to war against a country like Iran, any nation state in the contemporary world, you invariably cause a rally around the flag of fame. So the idea that you're going to get rid of this regime is simply wrong. And then, if you look at how the war is actually evolving, it's very clear that we are in the deepest of trouble. What the Iranians have been able to do, as you all know, is close the strait. 20% of the world's oil goes through the strait. 1/3 of the world's fertilizer, which is enormously important for world food production, goes through the strait. And much of this is shut off. And this is beginning to have devastating consequences for the world economy. Most people don't fully appreciate that at this point in time. But this is one giant train wreck. And there is no way we can open the strait. Furthermore, you want to understand that the Iranians have the capability to basically destroy the 6 GCC states, the Gulf states, because those Gulf states are very vulnerable, in large part because of water. They need desalination plants to survive, and those are big fat targets, and the Iranians can easily take them out. The Iranians can easily take out all of their energy infrastructure, if need be. So they can do, the Iranians, a great deal of damage to the Gulf states. They can do a great deal of damage to Israel. Israel has a blackout, so we don't see or hear what's going on inside Israel. We catch glimpses of it. And the Israelis themselves admit that 8 out of every 10 missiles are now making it through and hitting targets in Israel. 80% of the ballistic missiles coming out of Iran are blowing through Israeli defenses. It's very significant. But most importantly, what the Iranians can do is they can wreck the world economy. You all know that this is amazing. The United States has allowed Iran to ship oil through the strait. Iran is shipping its oil through the strait. Do you understand that we have taken sanctions off Iranian oil so that it can be sold on world markets? That's happening right now. Why is that? Because we need all the oil we can get in the global oil market. We've taken sanctions off the Russians too, so Russian oil flows in to world oil markets. President Trump talks about destroying Iranian oil installations, which will in effect stop the flow of Iranian oil into the world market. This would be disastrous. We need that Iranian oil in world markets. So you can see the extent to which Iran is in the driver's seat. Now, let me conclude by talking about how this war ends. First of all, let's start with the Iranians. The Iranians have a vested interest in prolonging this war, because the longer this war goes on, the more trouble the United States and its allies are in. President Trump fully understands that. Last year, the 12-day war, June 2025, it was the Israelis who were running that defensive vessels. And President Trump, who was scared that the Iranians were going to close down the Strait of Hormuz, that caused us to fall off the war. That's why the war only lasted 12 days. It wasn't because the Iranians. In fact, I argued at the time, and many other people argued at the time, if I were playing Iran's hand, I would not have quit last June. I would have continued because Iran was moving into the driver's seat. Well, they're in the driver's seat now. They know it, and they therefore have a vested interest in stringing this out and doing great damage to the international economy. Because the more damage they do to the international economy, the more leverage they have in any deal that is worked out. And they need that leverage. What about President Trump? What can President Trump do? Well, he's scrambling for an exit option. Everybody knows that. But the Iranians are not giving him an exit option. The Iranians would be out of their mind to conclude a peace agreement now with Iran. Some sort of ceasefire back to the status quo ending. They didn't want to do that. What they want to do is they want to inflict massive punishment on the Americans. They want to make the Americans and the Israelis pay for what they did. So that when there is a final deal, they get a good arrangement. So, there's no exit man for Trump. What's he going to do? Go up the escalation ladder? He goes up the escalation ladder. The Iranians will go up the escalation ladder with him. They've made that very clear. They will beat us at every rung of the escalation ladder. They have escalation dominance. Why do they have escalation dominance? Because they have the ability to wreck the Gulf states. They have the ability to inflict great damage on Israel. But most importantly, they have the ability to wreck the international economy. And that gives them enormous leverage. This tells you Trump is deeply screwed. No exit rent, no escalation option. The other side has all the cards.
Thank you everyone for joining us this afternoon. Thank you to Lisa and to my co-panelists. My presentation basically follows on Professor Mearsheimer. I'm going to talk a little bit about what I think the United States and Israel got wrong about Iran, how they miscalculated, how that's affected the conduct of the war over the past 2 weeks or so, and where we might be headed in a post-war situation. So what did they get wrong? What did the US and Israel get wrong, and why did they attack? I think first and foremost, and I'm going to talk least about this one aspect, is they underestimated the Iranian military, its military capabilities and its will to escalate and to turn this war into a regional war. Now, some of that was Iran's own fault. It was Iran's own fault in the sense that ever since 2020, at least 2020, when there were opportunities to respond to Israeli or American aggression, their responses were rather cautious or measured. So it was a pre-communicated missile barrage on some American military base. That was typically the response. So in Iraq or in Qatar, and that was it. And then they called it off. So the message that communicated to the Americans and Israelis was that this is a weak military. It's not able to sustain a prolonged war, and it's not willing to escalate. And then they also underestimated Iran's missile and drone capabilities and its ability to sustain a prolonged war. If you look at the various statements that were made by Israelis and Americans ever since the end of the 12-day war, it was always this number, the same number pretty much repeated again and again. 85% or something like this of Iran's missile capability has been knocked down. And they've repeated this again and again and again. And one wonders how many times you can knock out 85% of its capabilities, right? So they underestimated that. So I can talk more about this in Q&A if you want, but clearly the state's ability, the United States' ability to sustain a missile barrage and to sustain drone warfare, and to do so across a very vast geography, that has been a continuous aspect of this past war, and it's unprecedented, right? Iran's never done this. Now, the other thing they miscalculated, the U.S. and Israel miscalculated, was the resilience of the state. And there are, I think we can talk about the reasons for this, but the fundamental miscalculation, I think, is what John pointed out, which is that they thought if they take out the top leadership, if they take out the supreme leader, the top commanders, that the state will either immediately collapse or it'll surrender. And that's the there was a sense of the Venezuela model, which they were explicitly talking about. Now, this didn't happen, and the reason that it didn't happen is even though there is a supreme leader who has the final say on all matters in Iran, the political establishment is a very complicated and sort of diffused system, and it's made up of a fairly vast and robust structure of institutions. These are entrenched and these are fairly coherent, right? They've been operating in this way for over 47 years. This includes a really enormous and well-functioning bureaucracy, right? So there's millions of people on the state payroll, and that includes many centers and ministries, institutions, courts, and so on. There's also a deep state, right? There's a deep state with the Islamic Revolutionary Guards Corps at its center and a network of political leaders who are able to step in the case of an emergency, in the case of a crisis, and that's what they've done now. And you can see the sort of the operation of both the deep state and the institutional robustness based on some of the coherent decisions that have been made just over the past month. So setting aside the military aspect, which has been pretty coherent, you can see, for instance, in the replacement of the supreme leader with a new supreme leader, right, the decision-making process for that. And then most recently, just a few days ago, there was a preliminary decision in the National Security, I think, or the Security Commission of the Parliament, to institute a new legal regime or a new control regime for the Strait of Hormuz post. Right? So they're already making these plans, and it's, you have to have communication and structure and robustness to be able to make these kinds of decisions. Militarily, let me say one more thing, which is that the state is also not just a political and a military establishment, but also a state that provisions for the people, right? So the state is continuing to function despite bombings and attacks and so on. You have continued ability to secure the borders, you have the maintenance of internal security, you have provisioning. So there's no, as far as we know at this point, there's still no reports of shortages, right, of commodities, and things like that, and the bureaucracy continues to run. We were now in the at the end of the 2-week period of Nowruz, which is schools are off, the country's closed, but prior to that, schools were still running online, universities were still running. Sanitation, infrastructure, you still have people sort of cleaning the city. So the country is running. And then militarily, this is based on Iran's experience, both of the Iran-Iraq War, so 1980 to 88, but also its observation of various other wars that the U.S. has gotten into. It runs a decentralized, what it calls a mosaic system of defense. So it's not dependent on, the central command in Tehran. It's decentralized. So even if you take out a commander, first of all, there's multiple layers of command that are ready to step in, but also it's decentralized. So different parts of the mosaic can make their own decisions, but they also coordinate in a complex way. So all of this has remained pretty solid. Now, the other thing that the U.S. and Israel misjudged was the level of popular support for the state. And this is it's a pretty complicated question. And I myself was surprised by, to some extent, was surprised by this. I think part of the misjudgment has to do with the experience of multiple popular movements, popular protest movements over the past 10 years or so. And then the most recent version being in January when there was multiple days of sustained peaceful protest and then eventually violent protests, and then a pretty vicious crackdown that killed thousands of people. So this sense that is communicated was that the state is weak, that it doesn't enjoy popular support, and that it can, as John also pointed out, that if there is an attack, that this can easily promote a popular uprising. And of course, you will have heard that there are people both inside Iran and in the Iranian diaspora who have supported, who had called for military intervention by the U.S. and Israel, and then supported it, and some still do. So, I think this partly accounts for the misunderstanding. It's hard to say exactly what the level of popular support is, but I can give you two statistics that I think are helpful as a kind of as a ballpark figure. So in the two presidential elections in 2024, the most recent one, you had 50% of the electorate voting, which was a pretty low number by Iranian standards. So there's the number of the sort of voting statistic has gone down. I think 49% in 2021, that may have been the lowest. So 50% is a pretty low number for popular participation. Of these 50%, 45% of them voted for the loser, who was Saeed Jalili. So that's 22% of all eligible voters, right? Now, Jalili is, in sort of American parlance, he's a hardliner. Like, he's as hardliner as they get. So if you're voting for someone like Saeed Jalili, it would be the equivalent of voting, like, I mean, it's not a perfect comparison, but it's the equivalent of voting for a right-wing politician of the United States. That's 22% of people. Now, it's not a perfect comparison because there's economic dimensions to this that are populist, support rural voters, you know, the economically disadvantaged folks and so on that don't map at all on the Iranian context. But, you know, so you're talking about at least a 22% support rate. And people might say, oh, these numbers are manufactured or whatever. I mean, I think if the state wanted to manufacture numbers, they would have manufactured them much higher. Right? Like if you have a 50% participation rate and then of those only 45% voting for, your guy, then that means, it's probably something close to accurate. And then the previous election for that, 2021, you had 49% of the electorate voting. And at the time, Ayatollah Khamenei, the previous supreme leader who died February 28th, he did a lot to call, to encourage voting. And then the turnout was not great. Like the 49% turnout was, again, the lowest turnout that had ever happened. And the person who won in that election was Ibrahim Raisi, who's a judge. And again, he was for a time considered as one of the likeliest candidates for replacing Ayatollah Khamenei as supreme leader, right? So that tells you something about his kind of relationship with the sort of the top brass, right, of the Islamic Republic. And he was a conservative judge. He was a confidant of the supreme leader. And so, you're talking about, in his case, so he won 62% of the 49% who voted, which is 30% of all eligible voters. Now, what does this mean? It means that even if we assume, this is a faulty assumption, even if we assume that the 50% of people who have not voted in the last two elections are all opponents of the Islamic Republic, I don't think this is a correct assumption. But even if we assume that, we're talking about something on the order of around 25 to 30% of people who prior to the war, right, supported the Islamic Republic. Now, there's also what John pointed out, the rally around the flag effect, right? So you have, you have people who will have voted for a different candidate, or you will have people who will not have voted at all, and then there's popular sort of media images of folks going back to Iran from Turkey or from Germany and others, who've also sort of, the kind of national feeling has sort of gotten them to support the state in a way that maybe they would not have done prior to this. Now, there's also been misjudging, I think, of the continued ideological strength of the state, and I can talk about this more. I'll just say one thing, which is this idea that, the very fact that nobody in the leadership has escaped Iran. You don't have this sort of the Bashar Assad sort of response to go to Damascus, and they, everybody that we've seen has preferred to die in Iran rather than leave, right? This gives something of, it sort of reinforces the idea that the leadership itself buys into the system, right? It buys into the system and is willing to die for it, right? So that also reinforces something with the population. One thing that the state has also now done is turned popular support and popular presence on the streets into a defense strategy. So over the past few weeks, they've been calling on people to come out, either take up the squares or get on car caravans at night. And this is both to rally people, whip up national feeling, but also preempt the possibility of protests against the state and kind of any other kind of disruptive activity. So quickly, I think these misunderstandings have led to a shift in U.S. and Israeli strategy, and that shift has been towards targeting more and more infrastructure. So once you no longer hope that the population will rise up, then you don't care so much what ordinary people think anymore, right? If you just destroy the infrastructure, you're not damaging your chances, in other words, because that chance just doesn't exist anymore. So most recently, this has included, in the initial phases, there were attacks on border patrols, on border posts, there was an attempt to destroy the state's ability to maintain internal security by attacking police stations and checkpoints. And then, so this is more recent, destroying industrial capacity. And this is the most destructive attacks that happened were on steel production. So Iran's the 10th largest steel producer in the world. And if you destroy its steel capacity, that's a major blow to its industrial abilities. So manufacturing, but also it does have military consequences, but also much broader consequences for its national development. And then health infrastructure. So there was an attack on 2 major pharmaceutical production plants, and then most recently on the Pasteur Institute, which is a public health institute in Tehran, which is over 100 years old. And that's once you attack health centers, and this is not collateral damage, right? It's not you're attacking something else, and then the health institute gets, there's like debris that falls into it, or the blast effects. No, they were direct targets. So when they're direct targets, then that tells you something about what the goal is, right? It's the goal is to actually destroy the state's ability to care for its own population. And then finally, university infrastructure, right? So there are 2 engineering schools, 2 of the biggest engineering schools and physics departments in Tehran were attacked. And again, and this is of a piece with longer American strategy, Israeli strategy. At this point, they're the same, but of targeting scientists, right? So this is a pretty old strategy. Now, just to wrap up, what can we expect in a post-war Islamic Republic? I think a lot will depend on to what extent this strategy of destroying infrastructure continues and what kind of damage it ends up doing. Does it lead to state collapse or not? I doubt that it will lead to state collapse, but what I think we'll have, and we can talk about this more in Q&A perhaps, is we will almost certainly have a more militarized Iranian society. It's going to be less compromising on the international stage. It's going to, I think, I agree with John that it's going to try to exert long-term control over the Strait of Hormuz. It's going to be less tolerant of political criticism inside. It might loosen up socially, I don't know, we'll have to see. There already was some loosening up over the past couple of years after the Women Life Freedom movement. And then it's very likely to become nuclearized. So in a sense, everything that the US was hoping to get out of this war is going to gain the opposite. And certainly in the long term. Yeah, I'll leave it there, thank you.
So I'm a historian. I have to start from history. I'm gonna talk. I want to talk a little bit about the environmental aspects of this war, but I want to kind of start a little bit earlier and try to contextualize what's going on from kind of a little bit back about how this region has been historically functioning from the perspective of ecology and environment, and what basically the kind of oil and industrialization and kind of Western development have brought the changes that kind of led to this moment, and then how this kind of war has changed it. So if you look at the map, just as a political map, it looks like it's a flat landscape and everything looks the same. And you can actually do whatever you want, everywhere you want. But if you actually look at the kind of natural environment, it's not like that. So there is this region has very uneven distribution of ecological possibilities, and historically, people have kind of adapted by living where these things are. One of the most important ones is, of course, sweet water, and kind of moderate temperature, the ability of kind of geological formations to kind of create microclimates for long-term stability of settlements. And if you look at them, somehow, I don't know if you see my cursor, but this area is mostly Iran and this is Iraq. So some of the 2 major areas where historically most of the kind of big cities and large developments were centered on the 2 big countries of Iran and Iraq. And most of the production of the region has happened in these areas. For example, all around Iran, you have kind of agriculture in these intermountain areas. You have big areas of agriculture along the Euphrates and Tigris and southwestern Iran, you have huge amount of production you've had in the marshes of the Persian Gulf. And then when you get to the kind of Arabian Peninsula, you get a lot of kind of a smaller scale oases along the highlands of, for example, Oman or Yemen, and much, much smaller kind of trade posts of settlement around Sweetwater in this Arabian Peninsula. So post-1950s, when kind of the Western came into the region to try to kind of extract oil and bring industries, what happened is that all of these environmental conditions were really strained, and the model started to move to something that is hyper-engineered. And it was completely designed based on maximizing economic extraction and kind of geopolitical calculation. So basically, we shift from a model that has nothing to do with the kind of ecological potentials of the region. And the model in 1950s and 60s started just based on the timeline. First, the focus was Iran. Then it moved to Iraq, and then after that, in the 80s, and with the shift of the geopolitics, it moved to the basically suboptimal lands, which is the Gulf countries. I just give you two examples of, for example, how this has landscape changed. For example, this is from southwestern Iran, where this big river landscape was completely changed by basically American companies to massive production, industrial production of food, and then next to oil extraction companies, and then all of the population were either working or right now working in the oil companies or in these mass production industrialized areas. And all of the water is being extracted to basically provide for these facilities. So these rivers are not running, the population, so there was even before this war a huge environmental degradation. Another major problem is that the Persian Gulf is a very shallow water body, and it has an amazing biodiversity that is because of a very delicate balance between sweet and salty water. So all of these rivers from the Iranian plateau and from the Taurus mountain in Turkey, they bring huge amount of fresh water, and then they drain it into the Persian Gulf. So most of the biodiversity and amazing things that you hear from the Persian Gulf, and you might have had fun kind of going through doing tourism in the Gulf countries, they happen in that kind of balanced area between sweet and salty water. Of course, when all of these rivers and estuaries get kind of bounded up, for example, this is like a marshy area, you can see how fluid this environment is. So all of these facilities are being built up and kind of block the flow of water between these wetlands, which are the natural habitats of a lot of the species. People can't do a lot of the, for example, palm agriculture, which has been historically the biggest production of this area, relies on the natural tidal irrigation, where every evening when the tides come in, they push so it's been based on the natural push and pull of the sweet water. So all of this is gone. Basically, what happens is that you've had here, the life has changed. All of the population and development has moved from Iran and Iraq to these areas. You can already see this development. You have the fishing companies, communities are struggling, the destruction, the pollution, the oil, and then when we talk about desalinization, how this development happened, 90% of the sweet water of these areas, the urbanization, is based on desalinization plants. So Iran has 1 or 2 islands that are relying on desalinization plants. But almost entire Gulf country relies on desalinization plants. They have 0 sweet water. And then desalinization plants, what happens is that they constantly eject salt and heavy metals and basically heated water into the Persian Gulf. So you can calculate what is the cost of, what was already the cost of this kind of industry to the region. And on top of that, we have the effect of this war, the attack on oil depots. For example, in Iran, we had these oil depots were burned, and like some of them were burning for a few days, and they were acidic rain coming, and these chemicals stay in the environment for a long time, right? So what I want to say here is that now Trump, in the middle of that, he threatens to blow up Iran's oil. Okay, so we know what this disaster is already going on, and he's already threatening to blow up Iran's oil. Then he also threatens to blow Iran's power infrastructure. Going back to that image that I show you, these people do not have access to any means of production or water or even the running water anymore. So everybody is now basically kind of relying on a chain of going to the factory, getting paid, and getting pumped water and kind of store-bought food. So any, basically any kind of instability in the power infrastructure of the region means that hundreds of millions of people have no food or no plants. It's not like it's not like Illinois where you can go to the Wisconsin and get some food and come back. It's not like that. Everybody is basically relying on imported food and pumped water. And then, of course, Iran threatens to target desalination plants and other things in the Gulf, which, as we heard, really Gulf countries are in the reach of Iran, right? And Iran has not hit them yet, but it can. So now my question is, and then on top of that, the greenhouse emissions I heard that in the first 2 weeks there were 5 million tons of greenhouse emissions, and the equivalent of 84 countries total allowed use of carbon emission were used only in the first 2 weeks of the war. So it's a global problem. It's not just a problem of Middle East. Now I wonder, not to mention the debris from all of this massive bombing. It's really apocalyptic to watch these bombings. Like, I grew up in war, but like I see these wars and I don't recognize these bombs. They're not built for like human. I don't know what they want to bomb because they're so massive, and the amount of debris and burning after them that is added to the environment. So my question is, what is we heard about the tactical and political question. My question is, what is the future livability kind of line of thought for politicians, right? And I truly believe that they think that Middle East is an expandable part of the world. Like, we're almost done with the oil, because I don't really think they care about the Gulf countries anymore either. It's not about Iran, just Iran. And I mean, yesterday I was really surprised by the excitement of even some of my own colleagues about the moon mission. I mean, seriously? So I want to invite everybody who has had that excitement to read this beautiful book co-authored by one of our dear faculty, Professor Masco, and some of his colleagues, Fear of a Dead White Planet, that beautifully explains how all of these planetary missions are yet another land grab because we're done with this planet. I mean, I seriously think that this is not about Iran, this is not about the Gulf countries. They actually don't care about any part of it. This is like a general plan that, okay, we're gonna be done and we're gonna consume this oil. Probably we need a little bit of oil. We use Venezuela for a while, and then we're gonna start with other planets. And whoever can't afford it, that's their problem. Thank you.
Okay. Hi, everyone. Thank you for being here. Thank you to everyone at CMES and 3CC for organizing this. Thanks to my fellow panelists and to Lisa for being willing to moderate. I am moving with you to a much smaller geographical scale and a much smaller place than Iran. Lebanon, I was looking the other day, is 1/100th the size of Iran and has about 100 times the problems. So we're not going to go into them in like 10 minutes. But and I also will tell you that I'm a literary and cultural scholar. This is definitely not my comfort zone. So what I thought I would do today is situate the current war in Lebanon within the unfortunately longue durée of Israel's wars in Lebanon, as well as within Lebanon's current political climate, while offering a few preliminary thoughts on what could be different this time around. Okay, so according to the website warsinlebanon.com, someone born 20 years ago today in Lebanon has had 47.5% of their 2 decades on Earth affected by a war or other violence on Lebanese territory. I was born in the first third of the Lebanese Civil War, and so my personal number is 64%. And what this small example shows is that violent conflict has marked every living Lebanese person's life. And often, even in times of calm, individuals and institutions, but not the state. And sort of unlike Iran, Lebanon's state is historically and currently very not robust, very fragile, very vulnerable, which leads to its own problems that I will very briefly get to at the end of this talk. Individuals and institutions are constantly planning or anticipating what Hiba Bouakar has described as the wars yet to come, while actually living the wars that are currently happening. And come they have. I can talk more about the various disasters that people in Lebanon have endured, including the self-inflicted ones, such as the 15-year civil war and the recent explosion in Beirut's port district in 2020, which is one of the largest non-nuclear explosions in human history. But today I will focus on the moments where Lebanon and its civilian population have borne the disproportionate brunt of the Israeli military and its US-funded war machine, as well as its Israel's, in this case, expansionist ambitions. This latest war is the 8th Israeli incursion in Lebanon since 1978, and the 3rd since the Israeli army withdrew from its 22-year occupation of southern Lebanon in 2000. And here I'm not including the countless targeted assassinations, such as the 1973 landing and assassination of PLO officials, the car bombs, including the one that assassinated the famous Palestinian author Hassan Kanafani and his niece in 1972, and isolated but intentional attacks on civilian infrastructure, such as the raid on Beirut's airport in 1968 that damaged 13 civilian aircraft in response for a hijacking in Athens carried out by members of the Popular Front for the Liberation of Palestine, or the sonic booms and now more recently drones over Lebanese airspace that puncture the quiet regularly in peacetime or in war. Nor am I including, just for the recent present, the over 15,000 violations by the Israeli army of the ceasefire agreement reached in November 2024 when the last war ended. So between November 2024 and this current war in, March 2026. As hard as it is to give any context without cycling back further into Lebanon's complicated past, I'll focus today on the continuities between the 3 wars that have taken place in the last 20 years. Although this is partly because I just don't have enough time to go through the list, but I can talk more about long durée questions in the Q&A, it's also because the 3 are linked by what Maya Mikdashi has diagnosed as an increased willingness on the part of Israel to expand its targets to a civilian population and to flaunt the rules of engagement more blatantly with each iteration. This is cycling back to something Lisa mentioned at the beginning about the sort of what does it mean to live in a moment of war in the absence of even the most kind of superficial of human rights discourses or appeals to the UN, or whatever it is, right? So, for example, in 2006, the Israeli army introduced what it described, a military strategy it described as the Dahya Doctrine, named for the extremely dense southern suburb of Beirut that had been mostly inhabited by people from southern Lebanon, displaced not least because of the Israeli invasion and occupation that started in the 1970s. Gadi Eisenkot, the general in charge of the Israeli army's northern command, described the doctrine as follows, and the quote is on there: What happened in the Dahi quarter of Beirut in 2006 will happen in every village from which Israel is fired on. We will apply disproportionate force, again, not technically allowed in international law, on it, the village, and cause great damage and destruction there. From our standpoint, these are not civilian villages. They are military bases. This is not a recommendation. This is a plan, and it has been approved. Eisenkot went on to become chief of the general staff of the Israeli military before retiring in 2019. The Dahi doctrine, of course, was repurposed as the Gaza doctrine on an infinitely larger scale. This has created conditions, this and many other things, including the dissolution of a kind of liberal political order, has created conditions of acceptance and apathy, where repeated violations of the conventions of war in Gaza and Lebanon, such as in this particular case, in this particular war in the past month, the deliberate assassinations of journalists like Fatima Ftouni and Ali Sha'ar, who were assassinated by a drone last week, medical staff like the 52 medical workers that have been killed since the start of this recent war in Lebanon, and UN peacekeepers go relatively unnoticed. The Dahi/Gaza doctrine has now come full circle and is being implemented again against Dahi and southern villages that the Israeli army has decided to force evacuation. In the city, this is a domicide that happens in different ways. Through the bombing of entire neighborhoods amidst calls to evacuate, through unannounced bombings of urban neighborhoods, so catching people unawares, and through targeted strikes on individual apartment buildings that sometimes are announced and sometimes are not across the city. And you can imagine kind of the psychological warfare that all and any of these actions inflict on a civilian population. In southern Lebanon, entire villages are being decimated on the border as the Israeli army seemingly is preparing for a ground invasion and an occupation of 10% of Lebanon's territory. One of the differences between this current ongoing war and the war that began and technically ended in 2024 is the targeting and destruction of infrastructure, especially bridges. At the moment, 6 of the bridges connecting the far south of the country to the rest of the country have been destroyed. This was also a strategy that took place in 2006, except the bridges across the country were destroyed and not just in the south. For now, it's been exclusively almost the bridges connecting to the far south to the more northern parts of the country. This has effectively trapped about 150,000 people in southern Lebanon as Israeli soldiers dynamite villages around them. The Lebanese army, despite receiving billions of dollars in US aid since 2006, which were given mostly with the goal of managing Hezbollah, has withdrawn from these villages in face of the ongoing and anticipated Israeli onslaught, effectively leaving civilians without aid, military defense, no matter how paltry, or recourse. In the south, there are indications of ecocide as well, including the aerial spraying of glyphosate, which is the same chemical that is in Monsanto's Roundup, which you might have heard of, and the uprooting and taking to Israel of millennial olive trees. Israel has also consistently, since 2006 at least, on record, used white phosphorus, which ignites when it comes into contact with oxygen and literally scorches the earth and everything on it. Many of the villages and city neighborhoods currently under attack were razed to the ground and rebuilt in the period between 2006 and 2024. The estimated cost of reconstruction was at the time around $7 billion. The economic and international circumstances that enabled that flow of resources is no longer there. Because of the implosion of Lebanon's economy in 2019, which has remained unaddressed, again, ineffectual state, individuals do not have access to their own funds, let alone to any other kind of more systematic aid from the government. So even those with resources or potential resources to rebuild face more challenges than they did in 2006. This week, the Lebanese Minister for Foreign Affairs stated that unlike during the war in 2024, so just a year and a half ago, Lebanon had so far received only $30 million in aid compared to 2024's $700 million. It goes without saying that this will disproportionately affect people who are already marginal, including Lebanon's Syrian and Palestinian refugee population, at this point displaced so many times who can count, its migrant worker population, many of whom have also been displaced and shamefully abandoned by the people they work for, and other vulnerable communities. All this, and the current war is not over yet, this is so depressing, As of today, 1,345 people have been killed and 40 people have been injured, already exceeding the amount of casualties of the 33-day war in 2006, but not yet at the level of the war in 2024, where about 2,400 people were killed. Over 1 million people are now displaced, possibly long-term. Approximately 22% of the Lebanese population. So this is a graph that shows that the Lebanese are now the third most displaced population, internally displaced population on Earth. This literally is a 5-week-old map. 5 weeks ago, it was 2% of the population. As of today, it's 22% of the population. In Lebanon, there are more short-term and long-term anxieties. The former, of course, have to do with questions of the now. How and when will this end? Unlike Iran, Lebanon has no maneuvering power or anything it can bargain with, right? So it's dependent on Iran making true on its offer to always include Lebanon in whatever agreement it's going to come to with the Americans. So the first question is an immediate question. How and when will this end? There are no diplomatic maneuvers on the horizon, and the usual suspects of mediation in the GCC and in Europe are busy dealing with their own issues that are related to this American-Israeli war and other things as well. The state is ineffective, broke, and unable to manage Hezbollah, whose fighters, despite the attrition caused by their ill-advised intervention in Syria and the pager attacks and war of 2024, seem to have weakened less than people had anticipated. Again, at the end of the war in 2024, people were pretty confident, especially including the Israelis and the Americans, that Hezbollah was much weakened and in no shape militarily to do anything. This is proving untrue as this war unfolds. Medium and longer term, fears of civil war, or at least increased sectarianism, which can also be violent, loom large in everyday conversations and in political conversations. So there's back and forth already rhetoric about what is going to happen when this war ends to the people in various contexts, either to the Shia or to the people who have been perceived to be taking advantage of the Shia. Anyway, this time last year, I was invited to participate on a panel at Harvard CMES to reflect on the 2024 war. One of the things I talked about then was the cultural production of art in times of war. I knew I had to put art in here somewhere. Last year, I tried, in that period of constantly broken ceasefire, to make a distinction between the kind of art that emerges from a wartime quickly, like jokes and memes, versus that which emerges more slowly, in the aftermath of awful violence. Since 1975, both have coexisted in Lebanon. This year, just as a quick observation, there seem to be fewer memes and fewer jokes, but a lot more AI videos. Like so much else, there hasn't been time for the kind of cultural production that requires more sustained reflection. In the immediate now, websites like Wars in Lebanon, which I showed you at the beginning, have come out. I read this as a mournful symptom of the effect of recurring war on the Lebanese at home or in diaspora. A more humorous example, but one that is nonetheless telling, is jidarsod.com, to which people submit their ratings of the loudness of Israeli sonic booms. Even that website now has the header, "The reviews might be a joke, but the continued psychological attacks against the Lebanese people are not." Reporting a jidar sot, which is just the word, it just means sound wall, right? Because it refers to breaking the sound barrier, helps to bring visibility to these crimes. So please use this website responsibly. So I guess even humor cannot be very lighthearted in these terrible times. So.
One more time, I just want to thank Lisa and Alireza for organizing the panel, and to all of you for coming, and to my colleagues. I mean, I think in a moment when I imagine many of us are sleeping less and feel deeply distressed about many, many disparate aspects of what's happening, I think there is some comfort to be gained from learning together, and I'm just so grateful to have such brilliant, thoughtful colleagues. So when Alireza reached out to me a couple weeks ago about joining this panel, he suggested that I might use the time to speak about energy and maritime logistics. Some of you may know I'm very slowly working on a very long book about the Suez Canal. And so I think about these things sometimes. And as anybody who has been following the catastrophic events of the past month will know, the IRGC's capacity first to block and increasingly to manage shipping traffic through the Strait of Hormuz has quickly revealed webs of globe-spanning dependence on materials produced in and shipped outward from the Persian Arabian Gulf region, about which most people in this country, and indeed much of the world, were previously sort of agnostic or unaware. And so what I'd like to do in these brief remarks is to offer some guidance about the profound, globe-spanning, extremely dangerous transformations that the past month has set in motion and that are likely to intensify even if the war were to stop right now, which seems even more unlikely after last night than it did a few days ago. The key takeaway here, and again, this is something that I hope is useful to think with even beyond the context of this war, is that oil is not energy, or at least not just energy. I mean quite a few different things when I say that oil is not energy, and so I'm going to try to elaborate on that point in part by explaining why the frequent invocations in major media of two prior historical events in the region, the 1973 oil shock and the 1956 Suez crisis, have tended to misconstrue key details about what oil does in the world that we inhabit and about what those comparisons might actually mean. I'm actually going to work backwards for reasons of exposition, so I'm going to start with 1973. This is unusual. I'm a historian. Usually we move chronologically. But in the standard account that continues to circulate, when Egypt and Syria launched the October War against Israel, Arab oil producers in the region, in a bid to pressure the US toward brokering diplomatic negotiations for the return of territory seized and occupied by Israel in 1967, announced graduated production cuts and an embargo on oil shipments to the US. In this version, the so-called oil embargo caused global supplies to fall and prices to rise and produced a worldwide oil shock that precipitated lasting economic turmoil across much of the globe. Now, the comparison is apt to the extent that Arab members of OPEC attempted to leverage the economic dependence of Western states, and indeed the world economy as a whole, on oil from the Middle East to press the US toward a change in its foreign policy. And the significant and sustained rise in oil prices that occurred in 1973 did yield significant upheaval, especially for poorer countries that needed to spend their dollar reserves to import oil. But the first crucial difference with the situation today is that the best existing accounts we have of what actually transpired in 1973 make a compelling case that there was no actual global supply shortage. The relatively modest cuts and restrictions that the participating Arab oil states imposed were readily offset by increased exports from other oil-producing states, most notably Iran. The main cause of the price spikes was a successful campaign that happened to be taking place at the same time by OPEC as a whole to raise what was called the posted price of oil. Now, this is confusing. The posted price was the name not for a moving market value or a benchmark like Brent crude today, but rather for the fixed negotiated reference price that served as the basis for the taxes owed by oil concession holders to the states in which the oil was extracted. In a global context where the market price of oil had been rising for several years due to increased demand, the OPEC states pushed for a significant upward adjustment in the royalties they were owed, and the oil majors then passed those added costs on to consumers at the pump. The historical coincidence of the short-lived oil embargo generated enough confusion, uncertainty, and panic about the threat of supply shortages to make the price hikes relatively more politically sustainable. Now, my point in taking this first historical detour is that as devastating as the oil shock of 1973 may have been, it is likely to represent, at best, a very partial guide to the disasters that are likely to be coming. The events of 1973 are helpful as a reminder that while the price of oil in a capitalist world system engineered around the mass extraction and consumption of petroleum products will be felt across the globe, the effects of such shocks are profoundly uneven, often in ways that tend to amplify existing inequalities. Already, a growing list of poorer countries heavily dependent on petroleum and liquefied natural gas to power their export-oriented industries. We can think here of Bangladesh, Thailand, the Philippines, growing list of other countries, are being forced into impossibly devastating choices and a kind of cycle between energy rationing that then puts a squeeze on economic output and that will then make it likely even harder for them to purchase oil as prices continue to rise. And so I think already there is good reason to expect that what is happening is going to unleash massive economic devastation across much of the world. Public perceptions of what transpired in 1973, fueled by familiar racist tropes about the diabolical machinations of Arab oil sheikhs, moreover played an important role in consolidating a durable discourse about national interests in what is called energy security. One of the most important consequences of that rationale for the present moment in the US has been the thoroughly bipartisan movement spanning from the first Trump administration through Biden's term and into the present to shed substantive policy commitments to decarbonization, fan the flames of climate catastrophe, and reclaim the status of the United States as the world's top oil producer, a distinction the US had lost to Russia and Saudi Arabia shortly before the oil crisis of the 1970s. That development has a range of complex implications for how the current moment is likely to play out. And as a historian, I'm far more comfortable explaining what has already happened than making predictions about the future. But as with so much else right now, we can at least be confident that the Trump administration's pronouncements on the subject are a potent mix of dishonest, demonstrably wrong, and devastatingly cruel. So here are a few more details to track. The general point of my brief rehearsal of 1973 is that the oil shock then was not in any straightforward sense a reflection of global supply shortages. And what is coming for us now, as the last tankers that transited the Strait of Hormuz before February 28 reach their destinations, will increasingly take shape not just around pricing mechanisms and futures contracts, but around a growing list of actual material goods that are not available in the requisite quantities where and when they are needed. Because crude oil is priced globally but produced and circulated within more discrete geographies, the US is relatively likelier to experience the coming storm as price hikes on many key petroleum products rather than outright dearth. But the staggering hike in gasoline rates is just one of the more visible reminders that drill baby drill has done little to insulate even the American public from the blowback of this latest deranged spectacle of American militarism. And the story becomes all the more alarming once we recognize that oil isn't just energy, and the Gulf states aren't just exporting oil anymore. John commented in his opening remarks on the potentially horrific consequences of having roughly a third of the world's annual stock of synthetic nitrogen fertilizers trapped at the very moment when farmers across the northern hemisphere are making decisions about this spring's planting cycle. But as the political economist Adam Hanea has helped to underscore in a series of brilliant studies and articles over the last few years, through the staggering growth and diversification of the petrochemicals industry, petroleum has become not just a form of energy driving production, but the substance out of which a staggering array of feedstocks, the basic raw materials, upon which industrial production increasingly relies. In this sense, oil is everywhere in this room, not just in the comparatively minimal role it plays in generating the electricity for overhead lights, but in the clothes you're wearing, the keyboards on which some of you may be typing, or the pens you're holding, the carpet under your feet. And one of the more significant economic developments of the Gulf region in the past couple of decades has been not just a major diversification of producer states into new sectors of refining and chemical processing, but a concomitant elaboration of infrastructural and logistical linkages for routing those feedstocks toward industrial centers in Asia, and most notably in China. These material linkages represent forms of petroleum dependence that far exceed the parameters of standard narratives about energy, and indeed make the task of mapping the possible ramifications of the current crisis much more difficult. To offer just one example, Goldman Sachs earlier this week produced a report that anticipated that the US GDP will actually fall more than China's because of the war, because the PRC has moved so much more aggressively toward the adoption of renewable energy. While that estimation may again be read as an indication that the choice to sacrifice climate mitigation on the altar of national security was a massive failure, even on its own terms, it strikes me as likely to underrate the importance of all of the non-energy roles of oil that can't currently make their, or forms of oil that can't currently make their way to China. I'm going to conclude by exploring one final dimension of oil's more than energetic importance that has been absent from the other historical comparison that has circulated most frequently in recent days, namely the Suez Crisis of 1956. Now, most versions of this Suez comparison seem eager to make two pretty basic points. First, in launching a war under very thin pretenses, together with Israel, to topple and destroy a Middle Eastern regime that they regarded as some kind of threat to their imperial interests, Britain, and to a lesser degree France, miscalculated badly and effectively destroyed what remained of their waning global hegemony. The US under Trump is in similar fashion shredding the residues of its leadership role in the unipolar post-Soviet world order. And second, by blocking the Suez Canal during the war, Nasser turned a strategic economic choke point into a powerful weapon in a militarily asymmetric conflict. The Suez Canal, in this historical analogy, is actually still the Suez Canal to the extent that the Houthis in Yemen may yet decide to blockade the Bab el-Mandeb. But in today's version, the Strait of Hormuz is a kind of Suez on steroids in that the alternative routes for moving goods out of the Gulf cannot currently absorb most of what is trapped. What is missing from every version of this comparison I've been able to find so far is the main reason Britain actually opted for war. On this understanding, the actual Suez Crisis may have been already a catastrophic strategic blunder, but if the US-Israeli war on Iran is our Suez Crisis, it is a kind of idiot's upside-down version. The crucial thing to understand here is that in the 8 decades since the end of the Second World War, despite a number of other significant transformations, the organization of the world economy around a US dollar-centered monetary hierarchy has rested on a set of institutional arrangements whereby most oil in the world is bought and sold in US dollars. In the post-war era, this petrodollar system meant that the viability of the Bretton Woods system was anchored by the rapid spread of petroleum dependence across more and more of the Earth's surface. And in the post-Bretton Woods period since the early 1970s, it has continued to ensure that despite waves of nationalizations, the formation of OPEC, and the growing importance of national oil companies, oil revenues have continued to be denominated in dollars and therefore to flow through American financial institutions. Notably, it was continued primacy of this petrodollar regime that gave the Biden administration the technical means to impose monetary sanctions on Russia in the early days of the full-scale invasion of Ukraine. Back in the 1950s, while most oil was dollar oil already, most of the remainder, produced chiefly by the Anglo-Iranian Oil Company, was bought and sold in pounds sterling. And in a context where the domestic British economy was still devastated by the effects of World War II, the value of the British pound, nominally the second reserve currency under Bretton Woods, was heavily reliant on the fact both that continental Europe was a major consumer of sterling oil and that Britain could thereby meet its own oil needs without selling pounds for dollars. The point here is that in the 2 decades after 1945, British policymakers in London repeatedly went to extreme, even catastrophic lengths to protect their share of the world's oil trade still denominated in their imperial currency. It was specifically the idea that Gamal Abdel Nasser could block the flow of sterling oil to Europe that terrified policy planners in London and drove them to plot a disastrous invasion. In this light, by going to war with Iran, Trump seems to have given new momentum to the very sort of threat that the British, however misplaced and idiotic their intentions and actions, were seeking to avoid. Again, it is hard to know yet exactly how this will play out, but one of the most striking details of the new toll regime that Iran has been consolidating and about which Alireza spoke a little bit for regulating traffic through the Strait of Hormuz has been the insistence that the settlement of transactions in oil that transit the strait must take place in Chinese yuan rather than in dollars. I don't think it's realistic to expect that even if the toll regime holds, it will catalyze a rapid wholesale collapse of the current petrodollar regime, let alone the US financial system. But in conclusion, the point here is that the comparison with 1956 actually helps to illuminate another dramatic way in which, to kind of return to John's original point, this war has introduced profound new challenges to a US-centered world system that simply did not exist on this scale as little as 5 weeks ago. And I'll stop there.
We have plenty of time for a Q&A. Before we start with that, I wanted to ask the speakers whether they had any reactions to any of the presentations. Some of you referred to each other, and I wanted to give you a little bit of time to respond to one another. John?
No, I don't have anything to say. They were all terrific presentations, and so I'm open to Q&A whenever you want.
Okay, great. Anybody else? Aaron?
I have a question for John about the escalation ladder and one rung of it that does exist on the U.S. and Israeli side, namely the nuclear weapons that already do exist. And I wonder what you think about sort of the likelihood of their playing some role in how this unfolds. I'm thinking here about the limited but somewhat compelling reporting about the early days of the Israeli assault on Gaza, in which there were some suggestions that at least the craziest wing of the Israeli cabinet was kind of reaching for their nuclear weapons, and that part of the Biden administration's putative justification for supporting Israel was to try to restrain this. To the extent that there was any restraint then, there is certainly none now. And so, yeah, I wonder how you're thinking about this.
I can think of two scenarios where the Israelis may use nuclear weapons. One is if we start to go up the escalation ladder pretty quickly, pretty soon, and the Iranians get to what I would call the Gotterdammerung option, and they go after Dimona, and they hit Dimona. The Israelis may then use nuclear weapons against Iran. The second possibility, which is the one I've spent the most time thinking about, is once this war is over with, I think the incentives for Iran to get nuclear weapons are huge. And once Iran goes down that road, or the Israelis think they're going down that road, the Israelis now understand they can't prevent it conventionally, and the only way they can prevent it is using nuclear weapons. And I believe the Israelis have extremist views in the extreme, and they would use nuclear weapons in all likelihood in that situation. But those are the two scenarios I think where it's likely. Otherwise, I don't see them using nuclear weapons.
Can I speak briefly to that? I don't know whether the U.S. or Israel will use nuclear weapons, but purely in terms of rational calculation, right? If the goal is to get the Iranian state to collapse or to surrender, right? I don't think even a nuclear weapon will do that. I think in a nightmare scenario where there's a nuclear weapon that's dropped, or the state collapses through some other way, right? Through increasing pressure on the infrastructure, let's say the destruction of the power, which I think is a more likely scenario, or there's attacks on the oil facilities and so on. I think in that, if there's a collapse, what you're going to have is a Revolutionary Guards Corps that is many more times larger than Hezbollah, essentially turning into an independent militia from a collapsed state, and then continuing to exert control over the Persian Gulf and destroying sort of commerce through the Persian Gulf. So it's a nightmare scenario, not just, it's like a scorched earth type of situation, which could then go on for a really long time. You know, and if the Israelis have not been able to destroy Hezbollah, imagine just how much harder it is if you have a Revolutionary Guards that you cannot negotiate with through an apparatus of a state.
If I could just make one very quick point. The problem here, and it applies not only at the nuclear level, is that once a country's committed and it's going up the escalation ladder, it is very difficult to come back down the escalation ladder. And I think if the Israelis were to strike with nuclear weapons one time and it didn't work, they'd up the ante and use more nuclear weapons. And the advantage that the Israelis have in this case is that Iran has no nuclear deterrent of its own. So in a sense, the Israelis get a free shot every time at the Iranians. If the Iranians had nuclear weapons of their own, the Israelis wouldn't do this. And this is the argument for why they should have gotten nuclear weapons to begin with. I think the argument that you can make against all of this is, given your description, your excellent description of where this train is headed, the pressure on Trump to reach some sort of deal is going to be enormous, right? And try to shut this one down and minimize as much as possible the damage that you described. And if that were to happen, we would really put we would strong arm Israel in a major way, not to let them screw things up, because we would be trying to avoid the catastrophe ahead that you described.